The scream tore through the forest before anyone understood what it meant. Elena dropped the basket of herbs she was carrying and spun toward the sound, her heart slamming against her ribs. Around her, the pack warriors who had been training in the clearing froze mid-motion, weapons lowered, eyes wide with confusion. Then a second sound followed the scream, a deep growl that did not belong to any wolf she recognized, and every hair on her arms rose at once. She knew every wolf in the Ashwood pack by scent and sound. She had lived among them for 3 years, ever since the night Alpha King Cade had claimed her as his mate in front of the entire kingdom. She knew the low rumble of Cade's laugh, the playful yips of the pups, the steady heartbeat of a pack that trusted its king completely. But this growl was different. It was older, hungrier, and it carried a note of longing so sharp it made her chest ache even though she did not understand why. She ran toward the sound before she could stop herself. The warriors called after her, telling her to wait, telling her it was not safe, but Elena had never been the kind of woman who waited when something felt wrong. She pushed through low branches and thick ferns until she reached the edge of the northern border, the invisible line that marked where Ashwood territory ended and the wildlands began. And there, standing perfectly still in a shaft of afternoon light, was a man who looked exactly like her husband. For one impossible heartbeat, Elena thought Cade had somehow appeared ahead of her, that he had run faster than she could follow, but then the stranger turned his head, and she saw it. The eyes were wrong. Cade's eyes were a warm amber that softened whenever he looked at her. This man's eyes were a colder gold, sharp and searching, and when they landed on her, something in them flickered with a recognition that made no sense at all. "You must be Elena," he said, and his voice was Cade's voice, but rougher, as if it had not been used gently in a very long time. She took a step back. "Who are you?" "My brother never mentioned me." It was not a question. A faint, bitter smile crossed his face. "That sounds like him." Before Elena could respond, the ground behind her seemed to shudder with the force of a much larger presence arriving. She turned to see Cade emerging from the tree line, his broad shoulders tense, his jaw locked so tightly that a muscle jumped beneath his skin. She had seen her husband angry before. She had seen him fierce in battle and unshakable in council, but she had never seen him look like this, like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, deciding whether to jump. "Damien," Cade said, and the single word carried 10 years of something Elena could not name. The stranger, Damien, inclined his head with exaggerated politeness. "Brother, it has been a long time." Elena looked between the two men, and the resemblance struck her all over again, stronger now that they stood side by side. Same height, same build, same sharp cheekbones. If she had not known Cade so intimately, if she had not memorized the exact way his mouth curved when he was pleased, and the exact way his shoulders squared when he was troubled, she might have mistaken one for the other in a crowd. But she did know Cade, every line and shadow of him, and standing this close to his mirror image left her feeling strangely unsteady, as though the ground beneath her had tilted a few degrees. "You should not be here," Cade said. His voice was low, controlled, but Elena could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. "I have every right to be here." Damien's gaze slid back to Elena, lingering a moment too long. "This is still my birthplace, whether you like it or not. You gave up that right when you left." "I did not leave." Damien's jaw tightened. "I was sent away. There is a difference, though I am sure the story you told our people made it sound much simpler than that." The tension between the brothers was so thick that Elena felt it pressing against her skin like static before a storm. She had heard, in vague and half-finished sentences over the years, that Cade once had a brother. Pack members spoke of him only in whispers, and always changed the subject when she asked for details. Now she understood why the topic had always felt like a locked door. Whatever had happened between these two men, it had left wounds that had never properly healed. "Elena," Cade said without looking away from his brother, "go back to the hall. I will join you shortly." She wanted to argue. Every instinct told her that walking away now meant missing something important, something that might explain the strange, unsettled feeling gathering in her chest. But she also recognized the tone in Cade's voice, the tone that meant he needed a moment alone to keep himself from losing control entirely. So she nodded, cast one last glance at Damien, and turned back toward the pack hall. She had only gone a few steps when Damien's voice reached her again, quieter this time, meant only for her. "It is remarkable," he said, "how much you resemble someone I used to know." Elena stopped walking. Behind her, she heard Cade's sharp intake of breath, the sound of a man barely holding himself together. "Do not," Cade said, and the warning in those two words was unmistakable. Elena did not turn around. She kept walking, faster now, her mind spinning with questions that had no answers yet. Someone I used to know. What had he meant by that? And why had Cade's voice cracked, just slightly, on that single word of warning? By the time she reached the pack hall, her hands were trembling. She set them flat against the cool stone of the entryway and forced herself to breathe. Grace, her closest friend among the pack women, found her there minutes later, her expression immediately shifting from cheerful greeting to concern. "Elena, what happened? You look like you have seen a ghost." "I think I just met one," Elena said quietly. "Cade has a twin brother. His name is Damien." Grace's face went pale. She glanced around quickly, as if checking that no one else had heard, then took Elena gently by the arm and led her into a private alcove near the kitchens. "You cannot say that name loudly in this hall," Grace whispered. "Why not? What happened to him?" Grace hesitated, chewing her lip in the way she always did when she was deciding how much to share. "It was before you arrived, before Cade became king. There was an incident, a serious one, and Damien was exiled. The elders sealed the records. Even I do not know the full truth, only that it involved someone Damien loved very much, and that it ended in tragedy." "What kind of tragedy?" "I do not know the details, but I know that after it happened, Cade was never the same. He became harder, more guarded, and Damien was sent away that same season, forbidden from ever returning to Ashwood territory." Elena's mind raced back to the northern border, to the strange gold of Damien's eyes and the bitterness in his voice when he said he had been sent away rather than left. If the exile had truly been forced upon him, that would explain the resentment simmering beneath his careful politeness. But it did not explain the way he had looked at her, as though she were a puzzle he was determined to solve. "He said I looked like someone he used to know," Elena said. Grace's eyes widened slightly, and something in her expression made Elena's stomach twist with unease. "Elena, I think you should tell Cade you heard that. All of it. Do not keep anything back from him, not tonight." "Why? What are you not telling me?" Grace glanced toward the hall entrance, where the sound of approaching footsteps signaled that their private conversation was about to end. "Because whatever happened between those brothers, it never truly ended. And now it has walked right back into your life. Cade did not return to the hall until well after sunset. When he finally appeared, his expression was carefully composed, the mask of calm authority he wore in front of the pack settling back into place. But Elena had spent 3 years learning to read the small cracks beneath that mask, and tonight those cracks ran deep. His eyes found hers across the crowded room, and for a moment, something raw and unguarded flickered there before he smoothed it away. He crossed the room and drew her aside into the quiet of their private chambers, and only then did the mask fully fall. "I am sorry you had to meet him that way," Cade said, running a hand through his hair. "I should have told you about Damien long ago." "Grace told me a little," Elena said carefully, "that there was an exile, that it involved someone he loved." Cade's expression flickered, pain and anger tangled together in a way that made Elena's chest ache for him. Her name was Nora. She was Damien's intended mate, chosen for him before either of us understood what that would mean for all of us. She died. It was an accident, but Damien has never accepted that. He has spent 10 years believing I was somehow responsible for what happened to her. "Were you?" No, Cade's voice was firm, immediate, but there was a shadow behind his eyes that made Elena wonder if the truth was more complicated than a single word could capture. I loved my brother, Elena. I would never have harmed the woman he loved. But grief does strange things to a person's mind. It needs somewhere to go, and Damien decided a long time ago that it belonged with me. Elena studied her husband's face, searching for any hint of deception, and finding none, only exhaustion and old sorrow he had clearly carried alone for far too long. He said I resembled her. Nora. Cade went very still. I did not expect that. I did not think he would say it so plainly, so soon. Is it true? A long silence stretched between them before Cade finally answered. There are similarities, yes. The color of your hair. The shape of your smile. I noticed it myself when we first met, though I told myself it did not matter, that you were entirely your own person and nothing like a memory of someone else. He reached for her hands, holding them carefully, as though she might slip away if he were not gentle enough. It does not matter to me, Elena. You are not a replacement for anyone. You are the woman I chose, the woman I love, but I fear it matters a great deal to Damien, and that frightens me more than I can properly explain. Elena felt a chill settle over her despite the warmth of the room. What do you think he wants? Cade's jaw tightened, and for the first time that night, she saw something dangerous surface in his eyes, something possessive and fierce that made her pulse quicken even as it unsettled her. I do not know yet, but I intend to find out before he gets close enough to try anything foolish. Outside their window, the moon had begun its slow climb over the treetops, casting long silver shadows across the packed grounds. Somewhere beyond the northern border, Elena knew, Damien was likely watching that same moon rise, turning over whatever plan had brought him back after 10 long years of exile. She did not yet understand what he wanted, or how far he was willing to go to get it, but she understood one thing with absolute clarity as she stood there in her husband's arms. Whatever storm Damien had brought with him, it was only just beginning. The following morning, the pack gathered for the ceremonial welcome that tradition demanded be extended to any wolf of royal blood, regardless of past conflict. Elena stood beside Cade on the raised platform at the center of the training grounds, watching as Damien approached through the parting crowd with the easy confidence of a man who had never doubted his welcome, even after 10 years away. He wore formal attire, dark and well-tailored, and he carried himself with a regal bearing that mirrored Cade's own so closely that murmurs rippled through the assembled pack. Elena caught fragments of their whispers, disbelief at the resemblance, curiosity about the exile, quiet speculation about what his return might mean for the kingdom's stability. Damien stopped before the platform and bowed, a gesture that managed to look both respectful and faintly mocking at once. "Alpha King," he said, his voice carrying easily across the silent crowd. "Thank you for permitting my return, even temporarily." "You know the terms," Cade replied, his voice carefully neutral, though Elena could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a flame. "You are here under the Elder Council's supervision, for the purpose of the peace negotiations with the Eastern Territories. Nothing more." "Of course." Damien's gaze drifted, almost lazily, toward Elena. "And this must be your queen. I confess, brother, you have excellent taste." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through parts of the crowd, though Elena noticed several of the older pack members exchanging worried glances instead. Grace, standing near the front with her arms crossed tightly, looked as though she wanted to physically place herself between Elena and the newcomer. "Welcome to Ashwood, Damien," Elena said, keeping her voice steady and polite, refusing to let him see how unsettled his gaze made her feel. "I hope your stay here brings you some peace." Something shifted in Damien's expression at her words. A flicker of surprise, perhaps, or something closer to longing. "Peace," he repeated softly, as though testing the word for the first time in years. That would be a welcome change. The ceremony continued through its traditional stages, formal greetings, the exchange of diplomatic gifts, the recitation of old treaties meant to bind the eastern and western wolf territories together in uneasy cooperation. Elena performed her role as queen with practiced grace, but she felt Damien's attention on her throughout the entire proceeding, a steady weight she could not shake no matter how firmly she kept her focus on the ceremony itself. When the formalities finally concluded and the crowd began to disperse toward the feast prepared in the Great Hall, Damien lingered near the platform steps, clearly waiting for an opportunity to speak privately. Cade, sensing this, kept a firm hand at the small of Elena's back, guiding her toward the hall entrance without giving his brother the chance he was seeking. But Damien was patient. Elena would learn, in the days that followed, just how patient he truly was. That evening, during the feast, Elena excused herself briefly to retrieve a shawl from her chambers, the mountain air growing cold as the sun dropped below the horizon. She had barely stepped into the quiet corridor outside the great hall when she sensed someone behind her, and she turned to find Damien standing a respectful but deliberate distance away, his expression unreadable in the dim torchlight. "I did not mean to startle you," he said. "You did anyway." Elena kept her voice even, refusing to let him see any trace of the unease coiling in her stomach. "Is there something you need?" Damien studied her for a long moment, his golden eyes tracing her features with an intensity that made her want to step back, though pride kept her rooted in place. "I apologize for my behavior at the ceremony. I did not intend to embarrass you or to make Cade uncomfortable, though I suspect I managed both regardless." "You did," Elena said honestly. "Why did you say what you said, about my resemblance to someone you knew?" A muscle ticked in his jaw. "Because it startled me, seeing you. I was not prepared for it. I have spent 10 years trying to forget a face very much like yours, and then I return home for the first time to find that same face standing beside my brother, wearing a crown I once believed might have been offered to someone else entirely." Elena's breath caught. "You are speaking of Nora." Something raw flashed across Damien's expression at the sound of the name. Grief so sharp and unguarded that Elena felt a pang of genuine sympathy despite her wariness. "Cade told you then. He told me she died. That it was an accident, and that you have spent years believing otherwise." "Believing otherwise," Damien repeated, a bitter edge creeping into his voice. "That is one way to describe knowing the truth, while everyone around you insists on calling it something gentler. What do you mean?" He seemed to catch himself, drawing back from whatever he had been about to say, and the careful mask he wore in public slid back into place. "It is not a story for tonight, Your Majesty. Forgive me for bringing up old grief at what should have been a peaceful evening." He inclined his head, formal once more, and turned to walk away, leaving Elena standing alone in the torchlit corridor, with far more questions than answers churning through her mind. She did not tell Cade about the conversation that night, though she was not entirely sure why. Perhaps it was because she sensed that whatever truth lay buried beneath Damien's careful words was not hers alone to uncover. Or perhaps it was because some quiet, cautious part of her wanted to understand him better before she decided how much danger he truly represented. Either way, she lay awake long after Cade had fallen into an exhausted sleep beside her, staring at the ceiling and turning Damien's unfinished sentence over and over in her mind. "I have spent 10 years trying to forget a face very much like yours." What exactly, she wondered, had he meant to say next, before he stopped himself? And why did some small, unwelcome part of her want desperately to know the answer? The days that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm. Damien remained in Ashwood territory as promised, attending council sessions related to the Eastern peace negotiations and keeping largely to the guest quarters assigned to him at the edge of the pack grounds. On the surface, everything appeared calm, diplomatic, even cordial between the two brothers when official duties required them to appear together. But Elena noticed the small things. The way Cade's shoulders tensed whenever Damien entered a room. The way conversations fell quiet when the twins passed each other in the corridors. The way Damien's gaze always seemed to find her first, before acknowledging anyone else present, lingering just a fraction too long before he remembered himself and looked away. She began to notice, too, the way the pack itself seemed divided in its feelings toward the returning prince. The older wolves, those who remembered the tragedy from a decade ago, regarded him with wary distance, their eyes following him with something close to suspicion. But the younger pack members, those too young to remember the exile firsthand, seemed almost fascinated by him, drawn to the mystery and quiet intensity he carried like a second skin. Grace remained firmly in the wary camp. "I do not trust him," she told Elena one afternoon as they walked together through the herb gardens behind the pack hall. "There is something underneath all that careful politeness, something that has not healed right." "Grief can look many different ways," Elena said, though even as she spoke the words, she was not entirely certain she believed them herself. "Grief does not usually come with that kind of hunger in its eyes," Grace replied quietly. "Elena, I have known you since before you and Cade were mated. I have never seen you look as unsettled as you have these past few days. Please be careful." Elena wanted to reassure her friend, to insist that she had everything perfectly under control. But the truth was that Damien's presence had unsettled something deep within her that she could not fully name. It was not attraction, she told herself firmly. It could not be attraction. Her bond with Cade was the truest thing in her life, unshakable and certain. But there was something about the way Damien looked at her, as though he were searching for a ghost behind her eyes, that left her feeling exposed and strangely fragile in a way she had never experienced before. That night, as the pack gathered once more for the evening meal, an unexpected messenger arrived from the Eastern Territories, bearing urgent news that would upend the fragile peace of Ashwood entirely. The Eastern Alpha, whose cooperation the negotiations depended upon, had died suddenly, leaving behind a succession dispute that threatened to collapse the treaty talks altogether. The Elder Council convened immediately, summoning both Cade and Damien to an emergency session that stretched long into the night. Elena waited alone in her chambers, unable to sleep, her mind circling restlessly around everything that had unfolded since Damien's arrival. When Cade finally returned, well past midnight, his expression was grim and exhausted in a way she had rarely seen. "The council believes Damien's presence here is now more valuable than ever," he said, sinking heavily onto the edge of their bed. "His knowledge of the Eastern Territories, his old connections there before his exile, they believe he may be essential to salvaging the negotiations." "What does that mean for us?" Elena asked carefully. Cade's jaw tightened, and for a moment, the careful control he had maintained since his brother's return seemed to waver dangerously. "It means he is not leaving Ashwood anytime soon." Elena reached for his hand, feeling the tension coiled tightly beneath his skin. "Cade, I need you to tell me the truth about something. What really happened to Nora?" He went very still. "Why are you asking me this now?" "Because Damien said something to me, the night of the welcome ceremony. He said he spent 10 years believing something he called the truth, while everyone around him insisted on calling it something gentler. I need to understand what he meant." Cade closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, Elena saw something in his expression she had never witnessed before in the 3 years of their bond. Fear. Not the fear of losing a battle or the fear of failing his pack, but something far more personal and raw. "There are things about that night I have never told you," he admitted quietly. "Things I have never told anyone, because the truth is far more complicated than anyone in this kingdom believes." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling against the shuttered windows, and somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf's howl rose into the darkness, mournful and unanswered. Elena sat very still, waiting for her husband to finally break the silence he had carried for 10 long years, sensing that whatever truth he was about to share would change everything that came after it. "Tell me," she said softly. "Whatever it is, I need to know." And so, in the quiet hours before dawn, Cade finally began to speak. 10 years ago, Damien and Nora were set to be mated within the season, Cade said, staring at the fire that had burned low in the hearth. Our father arranged it when we were young, a match meant to strengthen an alliance with her family's territory. Damien loved her long before he understood what the arrangement meant. By the time they were old enough to be bonded, he loved her completely. Elena stayed quiet, sensing that any interruption might close the door he had finally opened. I loved her too, Cade continued, his voice dropping lower. Not the way Damien did. She was like a sister to me, someone who understood me in ways few others ever had. The three of us grew up together, inseparable, and I never once looked at her the way my brother did. But something happened that summer that I have never told anyone the full truth of, not even the elder council. What happened? Cade's hands tightened into fists against his knees. There was a rival pack testing our borders that season, probing our defenses before making a larger move. Nora insisted on joining the patrol that night, against Damien's wishes and against my better judgment. She was skilled, confident, certain nothing would go wrong. I was leading that patrol. I made the call to split our group to cover more ground. Elena felt her stomach drop, already sensing where the story was heading. The rival pack ambushed the smaller group, the one I had assigned Nora to join, Cade said, his voice barely above a whisper now. By the time we reached them, it was already over. She did not survive the attack. I carried her body back myself. I was the one who had to tell Damien what had happened, and I have never forgotten the look on his face in that moment. It was not grief, not at first. It was blame. He believed, and still believes, that I deliberately placed her in danger. Did you? No, Cade said fiercely, meeting her eyes at last. I made a tactical decision that night based on the information we had. I did not know the enemy would strike where they did. I have relived that decision every single day for 10 years, wondering if there was another way, another choice that might have saved her. But I never intended harm to come to her. Never. Elena reached for his hand, holding it tightly. Cade, that was not your fault. A wrong decision made in difficult circumstances is not the same as intentional harm. Try telling that to a grieving twin who lost the woman he loved, Cade said bitterly. The council exiled him not because they blamed me, but because his accusations against me grew violent and public, threatening the stability of the pack during an already fragile time. They believed distance would allow him to heal. Instead, I fear it only gave his anger 10 years to grow roots. Elena sat with this new understanding for a long moment, pieces of the puzzle finally sliding into place. Damien's bitterness toward his brother, his fixation on her resemblance to Nora, the strange hunger she had glimpsed behind his careful politeness. It all connected now into a picture far more troubling than she had first imagined. He thinks you took her from him, she said slowly. And now he sees me, someone who looks like her, standing beside you as your mate. Cade, what if he is not simply grieving? What if he sees this as some kind of chance to reclaim what he believes was stolen from him? Cade's expression darkened, the fear she had glimpsed earlier hardening into something fiercer and more dangerous. I will not let that happen. Whatever grief my brother carries, whatever anger he has nursed for a decade, I will not allow him to use you as a way to settle old scores. I am not afraid of him, Elena said, though even as she spoke the words, she was not entirely certain they were true. You should be cautious, at least, Cade said. I know my brother. Beneath that composed exterior, there is a wound that has never closed, and wounds like that can make people do things they would never otherwise consider. The following days brought little relief from the tension that had settled over Ashwood since Damien's return. The failed Eastern succession talks meant he remained embedded in pack affairs far longer than anyone had anticipated, attending council meetings alongside Cade and gradually becoming a familiar presence throughout the territory. Elena found herself encountering him more frequently than she would have liked, in the training grounds, in the gardens, in the quiet corridors of the pack hall where their paths seemed to cross with unsettling regularity. She began to suspect these encounters were not entirely accidental. One afternoon, while reviewing supply reports in the small study she used for her queenly duties, Elena glanced up to find Damien standing in the doorway, having apparently arrived without announcement. "The guards did not tell me you were here," she said, setting down her pen. "I asked them not to interrupt you," Damien replied, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I hoped we might speak, without an audience this time." "About what?" He moved closer, studying the shelves of records lining the study walls before his gaze settled back on her. "About the Eastern negotiations, mostly. I understand you have taken an interest in trade agreements between our territories. I thought my knowledge of the region might prove useful to you, given how thoroughly it has been ignored by my brother's council. It was, Elena had to admit, a reasonable request, and one that fell well within the bounds of her official duties as queen." She gestured toward the chair across from her desk, and for the next hour, their conversation remained entirely professional, focused on trade routes and border agreements, and the complicated politics of the Eastern territories that Damien clearly understood in exhaustive detail. But as the conversation wound toward its natural end, Damien's tone shifted, growing quieter and more personal. "You handle yourself well," he said. "Better than most queens I have encountered in my travels. Nora would have liked you, I think." Elena's breath caught at the unexpected mention of the name. "Cade told me what happened to her." Something flickered across Damien's face, surprise mixed with something darker. "Did he tell you everything?" "He told me about the patrol. About the ambush." "Of course he did," Damien said, a bitter edge creeping into his voice. "The official story. The one the council accepted without question. Convenient. How neatly it explains away every difficult detail." Elena's unease sharpened. "Are you suggesting there is more to the story than what Cade told me?" Damien studied her for a long moment, as though weighing how much to reveal. "I am suggesting that grief has a way of making people accept simple explanations rather than uncomfortable truths, Your Majesty. I loved Nora more than my own life. I have spent 10 years turning over every detail of that night, and I have never once been able to make the official story fit cleanly with what I know of my brother's character before that day." "What are you implying?" "I am not implying anything," Damien said smoothly, rising from his chair. "I am simply telling you that grief does strange things to memory, and that sometimes the people we trust most are capable of choices we never imagined they could make." He paused at the doorway, glancing back at her. "I did not come here today to poison your thoughts against my brother Elena. I came because I find myself, against my better judgment, wanting to know you better. You remind me of a version of hope I thought I had lost entirely." Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving her alone with her racing thoughts and a growing, uncomfortable suspicion that Damien's intentions in Ashwood extended far beyond diplomatic assistance with the Eastern territories. That evening, Elena found herself unable to shake the conversation, turning it over and over as she walked alone through the packed gardens, needing space to think before facing Cade again. The gardens were quiet at this hour, the last light of sunset painting the sky in deep shades of orange and violet, and she welcomed the solitude, however briefly. She was so lost in thought that she did not notice Grace approaching until her friend was standing directly beside her. "You look troubled," Grace said gently. "Damien came to see me today," Elena admitted. "He implied that Cade's account of what happened to Nora might not be entirely truthful." Grace's expression turned grave. "Elena, I need to tell you something I have kept to myself for a long time, something I probably should have shared the moment Damien returned." "What is it?" Grace glanced around to ensure they were truly alone before continuing, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I was a young pack member during that time, still learning my place among the healers. I was present the night they brought Nora's body back to the hall. And I remember something that never quite made sense to me, something I never spoke of because I did not want to add to anyone's grief." Elena's pulse quickened. "What did you see?" "There were rumors, quiet ones that never reached the official records, that the rival pack's ambush was not as random as everyone believed," Grace said carefully. Some of the older healers whispered that someone within Ashwood might have shared information about the patrol's movements that night, information that should never have reached outside ears. The implication settled over Elena like a cold weight. You are saying someone betrayed the patrol from within the pack. I am saying I heard whispers, nothing more, and they died out quickly once the official explanation was accepted, Grace said. But Elena, if those whispers held even a grain of truth, it would change everything about how we understand what happened that night, and who might be responsible. Elena stood very still, the garden around her suddenly feeling far less peaceful than it had moments before. If there was truth to Grace's memory, if someone within the pack had betrayed Nora's patrol to a rival territory, then Damien's decade of anger might not be misplaced grief after all. It might be justified suspicion aimed in entirely the wrong direction, or perhaps, terrifyingly, aimed at exactly the right one. She thought of Cade's face as he had told her the story the night before, the raw guilt and grief etched into every word. She could not imagine him capable of betraying his own pack, of orchestrating harm to someone he claimed to love like a sister. But she had also learned, over these past strange days, that even the people closest to her carried histories far more complicated than she had ever imagined. I need to speak with Cade, she said finally. Be careful how you approach it, Grace warned. If there is any truth buried in old rumors, uncovering it now, with Damien already circling like he is, could be more dangerous than you realize. Elena nodded, though the warning did little to ease the storm of questions swirling through her mind. As she made her way back toward the pack hall, the last light fading from the sky above her, she felt the fragile peace of her marriage beginning to crack beneath the weight of a decade-old tragedy that refused to stay buried. Behind her, unseen in the deepening shadows between the trees, golden eyes watched her retreat toward the hall, patient and calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to widen the crack that had already begun to form. Elena did not sleep that night. She lay awake beside Cade, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, and wondered how she could possibly raise Grace's revelation without sounding as though she were accusing her own husband of betrayal. By the time morning light filtered through the curtains, she had decided the only path forward was honesty, however uncomfortable it might prove. She waited until they had finished their morning meal and Cade had dismissed the household staff before speaking. I need to ask you something difficult, she said, and I need you to answer me honestly, no matter how it makes you feel. Cade set down his cup, studying her expression with growing concern. Of course. What is troubling you? Grace told me something last night. She said that during the time after Nora's death, there were rumors among the pack that someone within Ashwood may have shared information about the patrol's movements with the rival territory. That the ambush may not have been random at all. The color drained from Cade's face so quickly that Elena immediately regretted how bluntly she had delivered the question. He set his jaw and looked away, staring at some point beyond the window, his hands curling slowly into fists against the table's surface. I have heard that rumor, he said finally, his voice tight. I heard it a decade ago, and I chased it down myself, because if it were true, I needed to know. I needed to find whoever was responsible and hold them accountable, for Nora's sake, and for the safety of this pack. What did you find? Nothing conclusive, Cade admitted. There were suspicions pointed toward a low-ranking scout who disappeared from the territory not long after the incident, but we never located him to confirm anything. The trail went cold, and eventually the council decided it was safer to accept the simpler explanation rather than tear the pack apart searching for a traitor who may not have existed at all. Elena studied his face carefully. Do you believe there was a traitor? I do not know, Cade said honestly. I have wondered about it for 10 years, and I have never found peace with any version of the story, true or false. But I promise you, Elena, whatever happened that night, I had no part in it beyond the tactical decisions I already told you about. I loved Nora. I would never have knowingly placed her in danger. Elena believed him. She had spent 3 years learning to read every shade of honesty and deception in her husband's expression, and what she saw now was grief, confusion, and a desperate need to be believed, nothing that resembled the calculated deception of a guilty man. Damien implied yesterday that the official story does not fit cleanly with what he remembers of your character, Elena said carefully. I think he already suspects there is more to the story than what the council recorded. If he learns about the rumors Grace mentioned, rumors of a traitor within the pack, I fear what he might do with that information. Cade's expression hardened into something fierce and protective. Then we find the truth before he does. If there truly was a traitor, 10 years ago, I want to know who they were and why they did it. And if my brother is planning to use old suspicions as a weapon against this family, I want to be prepared to counter him with facts rather than fear. That afternoon, Cade summoned his most trusted advisor, an elderly wolf named Edwin, who had served as head of pack security since long before Cade had claimed his crown. Edwin arrived at the private council chamber with the careful, measured steps of a man who had survived decades of political intrigue through patience and discretion. "You wish to discuss the incident from 10 years ago," Edwin said once the chamber doors were sealed, his sharp eyes flicking between Cade and Elena. "I wondered when this conversation might finally happen, now that Prince Damien has returned." "You remember the investigation," Cade said. "I remember everything about that investigation, Alpha King. I led it myself, at your request, though the results were never made public beyond what the council chose to record." Edwin folded his hands before him. There was indeed a scout, a young wolf named Victor, who vanished from Ashwood territory within days of the ambush. His disappearance was suspicious, certainly, but we could never definitively connect him to the rival territory or prove he had shared any information at all. "Is there any chance he could still be found?" Elena asked. "After all this time?" Edwin considered the question carefully. "It is possible, though unlikely. I have maintained a quiet watch for any trace of him over the years, more out of thoroughness than genuine expectation of success. If he is still alive, he has done an excellent job of disappearing entirely." "Keep searching," Cade said firmly. "Quietly, but thoroughly. If there is any chance of finding him, I want him found before this situation with my brother escalates any further." Edwin nodded and departed to begin his renewed inquiries, leaving Cade and Elena alone once more in the council chamber. The weight of uncertainty hung heavily between them, a decade-old mystery that had suddenly become urgently relevant to their present circumstances. Over the following days, life in Ashwood continued its outward rhythm of ordinary duties, even as an undercurrent of tension ran beneath every interaction. Elena threw herself into her queenly responsibilities, partly out of genuine dedication to her role, and partly as a welcome distraction from the constant unease that had settled over her since Damien's arrival. She oversaw the distribution of winter supplies to the pack's outer settlements, mediated a minor dispute between two neighboring families, and continued her private study of the Eastern Territories in preparation for the resumed negotiations that would inevitably require her presence alongside Cade. Damien, for his part, seemed to have retreated into a more distant politeness following their conversation in her study, appearing at official functions with careful formality but making no further attempts at private conversation. Elena told herself this was a positive development, though some small, wary part of her recognized it as merely a change in strategy rather than an abandonment of whatever goal he was pursuing. She was proven right one crisp autumn evening, nearly 2 weeks after his return, when she encountered him unexpectedly during her evening walk along the eastern ridge overlooking the pack territory. She had taken to walking there alone in recent days, finding the solitude and the sweeping view of the valley below helpful for clearing her thoughts. She did not expect to find Damien already there, seated on a flat outcropping of rock, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. "I did not mean to intrude on your solitude," she said, preparing to turn back the way she had come. "You are not intruding," Damien said, glancing over his shoulder. This was Nora's favorite place in all of Ashwood. "I have found myself drawn back here more often than I probably should admit." Elena hesitated, torn between the wisdom of leaving immediately and a growing curiosity about the woman whose shadow seemed to follow her everywhere since Damien's return. Against her better judgment, she stepped closer, though she remained standing rather than joining him on the rock. "What was she like?" Elena asked. A faint, genuine smile crossed Damien's face, the first she had seen from him that was not tinged with bitterness or calculation. Fierce, stubborn beyond reason. She used to argue with the elders about pack policy until they threatened to ban her from council meetings entirely, though of course they never actually followed through, because everyone secretly respected her too much to silence her. His smile faded slowly. She had a laugh that could fill an entire hall. "I have not heard anything like it in 10 years. "I am sorry for your loss," Elena said, and she meant it genuinely, despite everything else clouding her feelings toward him. "Everyone says that," Damien replied quietly. "But no one truly understands what it means to lose the person you built your entire future around, especially when you have spent a decade believing that loss might have been preventable, if only certain choices had been made differently." Cade told me what happened, about the patrol, about his decision to split the group. Damien's expression darkened slightly. "Did he tell you everything, or only the parts that paint him as a grieving leader who made an unfortunate tactical error?" "He told me about the rumors of a traitor, about the scout named Victor who disappeared." This seemed to genuinely surprise Damien, his careful composure slipping for just a moment. "He told you about Victor?" "He did. He said the investigation never reached a definitive conclusion." Damien was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening valley below them. "I have spent 10 years believing my brother's incompetence, or perhaps something worse, cost me the woman I loved. I never considered that there might have been a traitor within our own pack, someone whose betrayal I could direct my anger toward instead of the family I have left." He turned to look at her directly, something unreadable flickering behind his golden eyes. "Why is he telling you all of this now, after all this time?" "Because I asked him to be honest with me," Elena said. "Because I believe a marriage built on secrets cannot survive whatever challenges come next, and I suspect more challenges are coming, given your return." Something shifted in Damien's expression, and for a moment, Elena thought she glimpsed genuine respect beneath his usual careful mask. "You are perceptive, Elena. Perhaps more perceptive than my brother realizes." "What does that mean?" "It means," Damien said, rising slowly from the rock and moving closer than Elena felt entirely comfortable with, "that I did not return to Ashwood merely for the sake of failed diplomatic negotiations. I returned because I received information, shortly before my exile finally lifted, that changed everything I believed about that night 10 years ago. Information about who truly betrayed that patrol, and why." Elena's heart pounded. "What information?" "Not yet," Damien said, stepping back with an infuriating calm that made her want to shake the answer out of him. "I need to be certain of the truth before I share it, with you or with anyone else. But I promise you this, Elena. When I am certain, everything about how this pack understands its own history will change. And I suspect my brother's carefully constructed world will not survive the revelation intact." He turned and walked away into the gathering darkness, leaving Elena standing alone on the ridge, with her heart racing and 1,000 new questions crowding her mind. Whatever secret Damien was carrying, whatever truth he claimed to have uncovered about the night Nora died, it was clear that his return to Ashwood had never truly been about diplomatic negotiations at all. It had been about this moment, this slow, deliberate unraveling of everything Cade and Elena believed they understood about their family, their pack, and the fragile peace they had built together over 3 years of trust. As she made her way back toward the pack hall beneath the first stars of evening, Elena could not shake the unsettling feeling that Damien's careful revelations were not truths at all, but the opening moves of a far more dangerous game, one designed specifically to pull her away from her husband and toward the brother who claimed to be seeking justice, but who watched her with the hungry, patient eyes of a man seeking something else entirely. Elena chose not to tell Cade about the conversation on the ridge that night, though the decision weighed heavily on her conscience. She told herself she needed more information before bringing him another fragment of uncertainty, another piece of a puzzle that seemed to grow more complicated with every passing day. But some quiet, honest part of her recognized a different truth as well. She was afraid of how Cade might react, afraid that his controlled composure, already strained to its limits by his brother's return, might finally shatter if he learned Damien was claiming to possess new evidence about Nora's death. She did not have to wait long to discover how right that fear had been. 3 days after her encounter on the ridge, the Elder Council summoned an emergency session to address escalating tensions among the outer settlements, where reports of livestock raids near the eastern border had grown increasingly frequent. Cade and Elena arrived at the council chamber to find it already crowded with pack elders, senior warriors, and, unexpectedly, Damien, who had apparently been invited to offer his knowledge of the Eastern Territories once again. The session began routinely enough, with reports on border patrols and proposed strategies for increasing security along the vulnerable settlements. But as the discussion wound toward its conclusion, one of the elders, an aging wolf named Priya who had served on the council for longer than Elena had been alive, raised a question that made the entire chamber fall silent. "Prince Damien," Priya said, her weathered voice carrying clearly through the room, "before we conclude, I understand you have been making inquiries among the older pack members regarding the events of 10 years ago, regarding the death of Nora and the disappearance of the scout known as Victor. Is this true?" Elena felt Cade go rigid beside her, his hand tightening almost imperceptibly around hers beneath the council table. Damien rose slowly from his seat, unhurried, his expression carefully neutral as he faced the assembled council. "It is true, Elder Priya. I have spent recent days speaking with those who remember that period clearly, seeking to understand events that were never fully explained to me before my exile." "For what purpose?" Priya pressed. "For the purpose of understanding the truth," Damien said, his voice growing stronger, more resonant, carrying an authority that reminded Elena uncomfortably of Cade's own commanding presence during council sessions. "I have recently come into possession of information suggesting that the scout Victor did not simply vanish, as the official record claims. I believe he was silenced, deliberately, to prevent him from revealing who truly orchestrated the ambush that killed the woman I loved." A wave of shocked murmurs swept through the chamber. Cade rose to his feet, his composure fraying visibly for the first time in front of the assembled council. "That is a serious accusation, brother," Cade said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "One you should not make without proof." "I have proof," Damien said calmly, reaching into his coat and withdrawing a folded piece of parchment, worn soft with age and handling. A letter, written by Victor himself before his disappearance, addressed to a contact in the Eastern Territories. "I obtained it through channels I would prefer not to disclose, but I assure this council of its authenticity." He handed the letter to Priya, who unfolded it with careful, trembling hands and began to read aloud, her voice growing more troubled with each line. The letter described, in Victor's own words, a payment received in exchange for information about patrol movements and a growing fear that someone within Ashwood's own leadership had discovered his betrayal and intended to ensure his permanent silence. The chamber erupted into chaos, elders and warriors alike calling out questions and accusations, the careful order of the council session dissolving entirely beneath the weight of this decade-old revelation. Elena watched Cade's face drain of color as he stared at the letter now being passed among the elders, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and dawning horror. "This proves nothing about who silenced him," Cade said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. "If Victor truly wrote this letter, it confirms he was a traitor, nothing more. It does not prove he was murdered, or by whom." "Does it not?" Damien asked, his golden eyes fixed intently on his brother. "A traitor who suddenly vanishes without a trace, whose confession letter surfaces only now," 10 years later, delivered to me by someone who found it hidden among old Border Patrol records that were supposedly thoroughly searched during the original investigation. Someone had reason to bury this letter, Cade. Someone had reason to ensure this truth never reached the light. And you believe that someone was me, Cade said, his voice dangerously quiet now. The chamber fell utterly silent, every pair of eyes shifting between the two brothers, waiting to see how this confrontation, a decade in the making, would finally unfold. I do not know what to believe anymore, Damien said, and for the first time, genuine anguish broke through his careful composure. I only know that the woman I loved is dead, that a traitor who could have explained everything vanished without trace, and that a confession letter proving his guilt somehow remained hidden for 10 years until I personally uncovered it. I am simply asking this council to consider all possibilities, including the possibility that my brother's investigation was not as thorough as he claims, whether through negligence or something far worse. Elena watched her husband's hands curl into fists at his sides, his entire body radiating barely restrained fury, and she rose quickly to stand beside him, placing a steadying hand on his arm before the situation could escalate beyond words. Prince Damien, Elena said, her voice cutting clearly through the tension of the chamber. If you believe this letter is authentic, then the appropriate course of action is a formal, impartial investigation conducted by the Elder Council, not accusations leveled in open session against the Alpha King without proper process. Several of the elders nodded in agreement, and Priya, still holding the fragile letter, cleared her throat to reassert order over the chamber. Queen Elena speaks wisely. This council will convene a formal investigation into the authenticity of this letter and the circumstances surrounding Victor's disappearance. Until such time as this investigation concludes, I ask that all parties refrain from further public accusations that could destabilize this pact. Damien inclined his head in reluctant agreement, though his gaze remained fixed on his brother with an intensity that made Elena's skin prickle with unease. As the council wishes, but I will not remain silent forever. Nora deserves justice, however long it takes to find it. The council session dissolved shortly afterward, the elders departing in hushed, worried clusters, whispering among themselves about the implications of Damien's revelation. Cade remained standing at the center of the emptying chamber, staring at nothing, his expression a mask of controlled devastation that broke Elena's heart to witness. Cade, she said softly, we need to leave. We need to talk, away from all of this. He allowed her to lead him from the chamber, through corridors that had suddenly grown eerily quiet as word of the confrontation spread through the pack hall like wildfire. By the time they reached the privacy of their chambers, Cade's carefully maintained composure had begun to crumble entirely. He is trying to destroy me, Cade said, pacing the length of their room with barely contained agitation. Whatever that letter says, whatever he claims to have found, he is using it as a weapon to turn this entire pack against me. Do you believe the letter could be authentic? Elena asked carefully. Cade stopped pacing, running both hands through his hair in obvious distress. I do not know. If Victor truly was a traitor, if he truly wrote that confession, then someone certainly benefited from his silence and his disappearance. But I swear to you, Elena, it was not me. I would never have orchestrated something so treacherous, especially not against someone I considered a friend. I believe you, Elena said, and she found that she truly did, despite the mounting evidence and the growing unease settling over the entire pack. But Cade, I am worried about what this means for us, for this kingdom. Your brother is not simply grieving anymore. He is building a case, publicly, methodically, and he is doing it in a way designed to make you look guilty, regardless of what the investigation ultimately reveals. I know, Cade said, his voice heavy with exhaustion and something that sounded dangerously close to despair. And I fear this is only the beginning of whatever plan he has constructed during his years away from Ashwood. That night, as Elena lay awake beside her troubled husband, She found herself replaying every conversation she had shared with Damien since his arrival, searching for clues she might have missed, warning signs she had failed to properly heed, the careful mentions of Nora, the pointed questions about her own feelings toward Cade, the claim of possessing information that would change everything the pack believed about its own history. It had all been building toward this moment, she realized with growing dread. Damien had not simply stumbled upon an old letter by chance. He had orchestrated this revelation with the same patient, calculated precision he had shown in every interaction since his return, carefully positioning himself as a grieving prince seeking justice while systematically undermining his brother's authority and credibility before the entire pack. And if that was true, Elena realized with a chill that settled deep into her bones, then whatever came next in Damien's careful plan would likely prove far more dangerous than a decade-old letter and a whispered accusation of murder. The formal investigation into Victor's disappearance began the following week, conducted under the strict oversight of the Elder Council, with both Cade and Damien required to submit to questioning regarding their knowledge of the events surrounding Nora's death. Elena watched her husband endure hours of interrogation with growing anguish, watched the toll it took on him as old wounds, barely healed after a decade, were reopened and examined under the harsh scrutiny of pack elders who had once trusted him without question. Damien, meanwhile, seemed to thrive under the attention, presenting himself before the council with the practiced sorrow of a grieving prince seeking long overdue justice, carefully avoiding any direct accusation that might expose him to consequences should the investigation ultimately clear his brother's name. It was a masterful performance, Elena realized with growing unease, one that revealed just how carefully Damien had planned this entire campaign during his years of exile. She found herself watching him more closely during council sessions, noting the small inconsistencies in his testimony that others seemed to overlook entirely, the way his claimed timeline of discovering the letter shifted subtly depending on who was asking the questions. She began keeping a private record of these discrepancies, uncertain what she intended to do with the information, but unwilling to simply stand by while her husband's reputation crumbled beneath accusations she increasingly suspected were far more calculated than they appeared. It was during one such council session, nearly 2 weeks into the investigation, that Elena noticed something that made her blood run cold. As Priya questioned Damien about the specific location where he had supposedly discovered Victor's letter, Damien's gaze flickered briefly toward Elena herself, a fraction of a second of unguarded satisfaction crossing his features before his careful mask of grief slid back into place. It was such a small thing, easily dismissed as nothing more than a passing glance. But Elena had spent enough time studying Damien's expressions over these past weeks to recognize genuine emotion when it broke through his careful control, and what she had glimpsed in that fleeting moment was not grief at all. It was triumph. Whatever game Damien was playing, whatever elaborate plan had brought him back to Ashwood after 10 years of exile, Elena understood now with absolute certainty that it extended far beyond simple justice for a woman he had loved and lost. There was something else driving him, something calculated and patient that had been building toward this exact moment, and she feared that she herself, standing as Cade's mate and queen, had somehow become the true target of whatever plan Damien had spent a decade perfecting in the shadows of his exile. That evening, Elena sought out Edwin, the elderly security advisor, hoping his renewed search for Victor might have uncovered something that could shed clarity on the mounting confusion surrounding the investigation. She found him in a small chamber near the pack archives, surrounded by stacks of old patrol records and border reports dating back more than a decade. "Your Majesty," Edwin said, rising respectfully as she entered. "I confess I did not expect a visit at this hour." "I need your honest assessment," Elena said, closing the door behind her. "Do you believe Damien's letter is authentic?" Edwin considered the question carefully before answering, his weathered face creased with the particular caution of a man who had survived decades of court politics through careful discretion. "The parchment itself appears genuine, consistent with materials used during that period. The handwriting, according to those who remember Victor's script, bears reasonable resemblance to samples we retained from his official duty reports. But something troubles me about the circumstances of its discovery, Edwin admitted. Prince Damien claims to have found it among old Border Patrol records I personally searched during the original investigation 10 years ago. I would have found that letter then, had it truly been present among those documents at that time. Elena's pulse quickened. You are suggesting the letter may have been placed there more recently, rather than genuinely hidden for a decade. I am suggesting the possibility deserves serious consideration, Edwin said carefully. Though I want to be clear, Your Majesty, that this does not necessarily mean Victor's confession is false. It is entirely possible the letter is genuine, written by Victor himself all those years ago, but recovered and preserved by someone else during the intervening years before being strategically reintroduced now. Who would have had access to preserve such a letter, and reason to wait 10 years before revealing it? Edwin's expression grew troubled. That, Your Majesty, is a question I have been asking myself since the investigation began, and I confess, the answer that keeps presenting itself troubles me greatly. Tell me. Prince Damien left Ashwood territory immediately following his exile, but he did not travel far, at least not initially, Edwin said. Records from that period, ones I have only recently reviewed again in light of current events, indicate he spent several months in the border regions before eventually settling in the Eastern Territories. Regions that would have given him ample opportunity to make contact with individuals who might have known Victor's whereabouts, or who might have been present when Victor met whatever fate ultimately befell him. Elena felt a chill settle over her as the implications of Edwin's careful words sank in. You believe Damien may have known about Victor's fate for years, and only chose to reveal this letter now, after his return, as part of a deliberate strategy. I believe it is a possibility that deserves far more scrutiny than the Council has currently given it, Edwin said. Prince Damien is a grieving man, certainly, but grief and calculation are not mutually exclusive states of being. It is entirely possible for a person to genuinely mourn a great loss while also pursuing that loss's resolution through carefully orchestrated means, particularly when that person has spent a decade in exile with nothing but time to plan his eventual return. Elena left the archive chamber with her mind racing, Edwin's careful analysis confirming suspicions she had been developing on her own since witnessing that fleeting expression of triumph on Damien's face during the council session. Whatever Damien's true motivations, whether genuine grief twisted by years of isolation or something far more calculated and dangerous, it was becoming increasingly clear that his return to Ashwood had never truly been about simple justice. She found Cade in their private study, poring over old patrol maps and border reports of his own, clearly conducting his own desperate investigation into the truth his brother's accusations had thrown into question. He looked up as she entered, exhaustion etched deeply into every line of his face. I keep returning to that night, he said quietly, trying to remember every detail, every decision, searching for anything that might explain how this letter could exist. How Victor's betrayal could have gone so completely unnoticed by everyone who should have caught it. Elena crossed the room and knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. I spoke with Edwin. He believes the letter's discovery raises serious questions that point toward the possibility that Damien has known more about this situation than he has admitted to the Council. She relayed Edwin's careful analysis, watching Cade's expression shift from exhausted grief to something sharper and more focused as the pieces began arranging themselves into a troubling new pattern. If Damien has known about Victor's fate for years, Cade said slowly, if he deliberately waited until now to reveal this information, timed precisely to coincide with his return to Ashwood, then this was never truly about seeking justice for Nora at all. What do you think it is about? Cade was quiet for a long moment, staring at the maps spread across his desk without truly seeing them. I think it is about destroying everything I have built here. My authority, my marriage, my standing among this pack. I think my brother has spent 10 years nursing not just grief, but a consuming hatred that has convinced him I deserve to lose everything he believes I took from him, starting with Nora and ending, perhaps, with you." The words hung heavily in the air between them, and Elena felt a fresh wave of unease settle over her chest. "You believe he intends to use this investigation as a means of destroying your credibility, so thoroughly that the pack might eventually question whether you are fit to remain their Alpha King." "I believe it is a very real possibility," Cade said grimly. "And if that is his true goal, then I fear he will not stop with a decade-old letter and a whispered accusation of murder. He will continue building his case, piece by piece, until he has manufactured enough doubt to threaten everything we have." Elena thought of Damien's careful attention toward her since his arrival, the pointed mentions of her resemblance to Nora, the deliberate cultivation of private conversations designed to plant seeds of doubt about Cade's honesty. If his ultimate goal was truly to destroy his brother's standing within the pack, what better way to accomplish that than by turning the Alpha King's own mate against him, or by positioning himself as an alternative source of comfort and truth that Elena might eventually come to trust more than her own husband? "Cade," she said carefully, "I think there is something else you need to know. Something Damien said to me on the ridge, before this letter was ever revealed to the council." She told him everything then, the conversation about Nora's favorite view, the claim of possessing information that would change everything the pack believed, the unsettling intensity in Damien's golden eyes as he had studied her in the fading evening light. Cade listened in tense silence, his expression darkening with each new detail she revealed. "You should have told me immediately," he said when she finished, though his voice held more worry than anger. "I know," Elena admitted. "I was afraid of how you might react, afraid of adding more weight to everything already troubling you. That was wrong of me, and I am sorry." Cade pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, and she felt the tension coiled through his body, the barely restrained fury simmering beneath his careful control. "Elena, I need you to promise me something. Whatever conversations Damien attempts to initiate with you going forward, whatever claims he makes or information he offers to share, I need you to tell me immediately. I cannot protect this family, this pack, if I am fighting battles I do not know are being waged." "I promise," Elena said, and she meant it fully, understanding now with painful clarity just how dangerous her earlier hesitation had been. But even as she made that promise, held safely in her husband's arms, a small, uneasy voice in the back of her mind wondered whether Damien's plan had already progressed further than either of them realized, whether the careful seeds of doubt he had been planting during their private conversations had already begun to take root in ways neither of them could yet see clearly. 3 days later, that uneasy suspicion proved entirely justified, when a second piece of evidence surfaced before the Elder Council, one that would push the fragile investigation and Cade's carefully maintained composure to their absolute breaking point. The council chamber was crowded to capacity when Priya called the session to order, word having spread throughout Ashwood that Damien intended to present additional evidence regarding the decade-old tragedy. Elena sat beside Cade at the head of the chamber, watching the assembled elders and pack members with a growing sense of dread that had settled over her since Edwin's troubling revelations 3 nights before. Damien rose when called upon, his expression composed and grave, carrying himself with the practiced dignity of a man burdened by painful duty rather than a man executing a carefully planned campaign of destruction. Elena studied him closely now, searching for any trace of the triumph she had glimpsed during the previous session, but he revealed nothing, his mask flawlessly maintained before the watching council. "Elders," Damien began, "I did not wish to bring this forward. I have agonized over whether doing so serves justice or merely deepens wounds that have already caused this pack tremendous pain. But I believe the truth, however difficult, must be honored above comfort." He produced a second document, this one appearing far more official than the worn letter he had presented previously, bearing what appeared to be an official seal that made several elders lean forward with visible concern. This is a witness statement, Damien continued, taken by a Border Patrol officer from the Eastern Territories, describing an encounter he had 10 years ago with a wolf matching Victor's description, in the days immediately following Nora's death. According to this statement, Victor was traveling under guard, escorted by two wolves whose descriptions closely match warriors who served directly under my brother's command at that time. The chamber erupted into stunned murmurs. Elena felt Cade go rigid beside her. His breathing growing shallow and controlled in the way she had learned meant he was fighting desperately to maintain his composure. "This proves nothing," Cade said, rising to his feet, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that silenced the chamber's murmuring instantly. "A vague description from a border officer, 10 years after the fact, cannot possibly be verified as accurate testimony against specific individuals. Perhaps not conclusively," Damien acknowledged, "but combined with Victor's confession letter, it paints a deeply troubling picture, brother. A traitor who confesses his betrayal, who is then seen being escorted by warriors under your direct command, who subsequently vanishes entirely and is never heard from again. I ask this counsel honestly, what conclusion would any reasonable observer draw from such a pattern of evidence?" "The conclusion that someone is very carefully constructing a narrative designed to implicate me," Cade said, his voice rising now, the careful control he had maintained throughout the investigation finally beginning to crack under the mounting pressure. "Brother, I do not know what has happened to you during these years of exile, but I no longer recognize the man standing before this council. You are building a case against me using evidence that conveniently surfaces only after your return, presented with a precision that suggests far more preparation than genuine, spontaneous discovery." Damien's composed expression finally cracked as well, genuine anger flashing across his features for the first time since his return to Ashwood. "Preparation. Yes, brother, I confess to preparation. I spent 10 years in exile with nothing but time to search for the truth of what happened to the woman I loved, following every lead, questioning every witness I could locate, piecing together fragments of evidence that this council's original investigation somehow entirely failed to uncover. Forgive me for being thorough in seeking justice for Nora's death." "Justice," Cade repeated bitterly. "Is that truly what this is about, Damien? Or has this always been about something else entirely, something you have never once spoken honestly about before this council?" The two brothers stood facing each other across the chamber, the air between them crackling with a decade of unresolved anger and grief, and Elena watched with growing horror as the confrontation threatened to spiral entirely beyond the council's ability to control. "Enough," Priya finally called out, her voice carrying the weight of long-practiced authority. "This council will formally review both pieces of evidence presented today, along with continued investigation into the whereabouts of the scout Victor and the warriors named in this witness statement. Until such review concludes, I strongly urge both of you to remember that this pack's stability depends on the perception of unity among its leadership, regardless of whatever grievances exist between you privately." The session dissolved into chaos shortly afterward, elders departing in worried clusters, while pack members whispered anxiously among themselves about what this escalating conflict might mean for Ashwood's future stability. Elena guided Cade from the chamber as quickly as possible, sensing that his careful control was hanging by the thinnest of threads and desperate to remove him from public scrutiny before it finally snapped entirely. They had barely reached the privacy of the corridor outside the chamber when Cade rounded on her, his amber eyes blazing with an intensity that made her breath catch. "He named specific warriors," Cade said, his voice shaking with barely restrained fury. "Warriors who served under my direct command. If this council believes even a fraction of what he is suggesting, they will begin questioning whether I ordered Victor's silencing myself." "No one who truly knows you would believe that," Elena said, though even as she spoke the words, she recognized the uncertainty creeping into her own voice. Cade caught the hesitation immediately, his expression shifting from fury to something far more wounded. "Do you believe it, Elena? Even for a moment, has doubt crossed your mind about what I might be capable of?" "Of course not," Elena said quickly, reaching for his hands. Cade, I know you. I know your heart. Whatever evidence Damien presents, however carefully constructed his case appears, I do not believe for a single moment that you ordered anyone's death. But even as she spoke the reassurance, she could see that something had shifted in Cade's expression, a wariness that had not existed before this confrontation, and she realized with growing dread that Damien's careful campaign had achieved exactly what she had feared it might. It had planted seeds of doubt not just within the pack, but within the very foundation of trust that held her marriage together. That night, as tension continued rippling through Ashwood in the aftermath of the council session, Elena found herself unable to settle into sleep, her mind churning with everything that had unfolded. She eventually rose from bed, careful not to wake Cade, who had finally succumbed to exhausted, restless sleep after hours of pacing their chambers in barely contained agitation. She made her way to the pack archives, driven by an urgent need to review the original investigation records herself, hoping to find some detail that might have been overlooked, some clue that could help her understand the truth buried beneath a decade of grief and calculated accusation. The archive chamber was dark and silent at this late hour, illuminated only by the moonlight filtering through narrow windows near the ceiling. She had been searching through old patrol records for nearly an hour when she heard the soft sound of footsteps approaching from the corridor outside. She froze, uncertain whether to call out or remain hidden, and was startled when the chamber door opened to reveal Damien standing in the doorway, apparently as surprised to find her there as she was to see him. Elena, he said, recovering quickly from his surprise, I did not expect to find you here at this hour. I could say the same of you, Elena replied warily, straightening from the records she had been examining. What brings you to the archives so late? Damien hesitated, something conflicted crossing his expression before he stepped further into the room, closing the door quietly behind him. I came to review the original patrol assignments from that night, the ones detailing exactly which warriors were positioned where. I wanted to verify certain details before presenting them formally to the council. Building your case further, Elena said, unable to keep a note of accusation from her voice. Seeking the truth, Damien corrected, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. He studied her for a long moment in the dim moonlight, and when he spoke again, his tone had shifted into something quieter, more vulnerable than she had heard from him before. Do you truly believe I am fabricating evidence against my own brother, Elena? Do you believe I would construct such an elaborate deception, using Nora's memory as a weapon, simply to destroy him? I do not know what to believe anymore, Elena admitted honestly. I know that every piece of evidence you have presented has arrived with suspicious timing, precisely calculated to inflict maximum damage on Cade's standing before this council. I know that Edwin, who conducted the original investigation himself, has raised serious questions about how a letter supposedly buried for 10 years could have escaped his thorough search of those exact records. Something flickered across Damien's face, a flash of something that might have been alarm quickly suppressed beneath his careful composure. Edwin has always been fiercely loyal to my brother. I would expect nothing less than skepticism from him regarding evidence that threatens Cade's authority. Or perhaps, Elena said carefully, watching his reaction closely, Edwin's skepticism is warranted, because the evidence itself was never genuinely buried at all, but rather preserved and strategically revealed at precisely the moment that would cause maximum damage to a marriage and a kingdom you seem determined to destroy. For a long, tense moment, Damien said nothing, his expression unreadable in the dim moonlight filtering through the archive windows. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its careful, grieving cadence entirely, replaced by something colder and more calculating than Elena had ever heard from him before. You are far more perceptive than my brother deserves as a mate, he said quietly. Perhaps it is time I stopped pretending otherwise and told you the truth about exactly what I intend to accomplish here in Ashwood. Elena's heart pounded as she took an instinctive step back, putting the width of an old reading table between herself and Damien. Tell me then. Tell me the truth for once. Damien moved closer, though he stopped a respectful distance away, seeming to sense her wariness. I did not fabricate Victor's letter. That much is genuine, I promise you. I truly did spend years searching for answers about Nora's death, questioning old contacts, following threads that eventually led me to a former Eastern Territory soldier who had preserved the letter after finding it among Victor's belongings following his disappearance. Then, what have you fabricated? Nothing, exactly, Damien said, his voice carrying a strange, unsettling honesty now that the careful mask had finally slipped away. But I confess, I have chosen the timing and manner of my revelations very carefully, Elena. Not because the evidence is false, but because I understood that presenting it all at once would have been dismissed too easily. I needed the pack, the council, and most importantly, you, to begin questioning my brother's character gradually, piece by piece, until the doubt became too significant to simply ignore. Why? What could you possibly gain from destroying his reputation this way? Damien's expression turned bleak, old grief resurfacing beneath his calculated composure. Because for 10 years, I have watched from exile as my brother built the life that should have been mine. He kept his throne, his freedom, his standing among our people, while I lost everything that mattered to me and was cast out for daring to demand accountability for it. And now he has found happiness again, has claimed a mate who reminds me achingly of everything I lost, while I have had nothing but grief and isolation to keep me company. The raw honesty in his voice sent a chill through Elena, understanding finally crystallizing about the true nature of what had been driving Damien since his return. This was never truly about proving Cade guilty of Nora's death, was it? This is about jealousy, about wanting what he has. Damien did not deny it. Can you truly blame me? I loved Nora with everything I possessed, and I lost her through circumstances I still do not fully understand. I have spent a decade in exile, alone, while my brother ruled this kingdom and eventually found love again. Is it truly so unreasonable that some part of me wants him to understand what it feels like to lose everything he values most? Including me, Elena said quietly, the full weight of his intentions finally becoming clear. You want to use this investigation, this manufactured doubt, to drive a wedge between Cade and me. You want him to lose his mate the way you lost yours. I want justice, Damien said, though his voice wavered with an uncertainty that revealed the lie even as he spoke it. But I will not deny that watching you, getting to know you these past weeks, has awakened something in me I thought I had buried alongside Nora 10 years ago. You remind me so much of her, Elena, not merely in appearance but in spirit, in the fierce intelligence behind your eyes. I find myself wondering whether fate has offered me a second chance at happiness, one my brother stole from me the first time. I am not Nora, Elena said firmly, backing further away from him despite his careful distance. I am not a replacement for someone you lost, and I will never be anything other than Cade's mate. Whatever grief and jealousy you carry, Damien, you cannot resolve it by trying to claim what belongs to your brother. Something dark flickered across Damien's expression, the careful vulnerability he had shown moments before, hardening once more into something colder and more determined. Belongs to my brother. Yes, that is precisely the problem, is it not? Everything in this kingdom has always belonged to Cade, simply because he happened to be born mere minutes before me. The throne, the pack's loyalty, and now you as well. I have spent my entire life standing in his shadow, Elena, and I am finished accepting that as my permanent fate. What exactly do you intend to do? Elena asked, fear creeping into her voice despite her efforts to remain composed. There is an ancient law, Damien said, his voice growing quieter, but somehow more menacing for its calm. One rarely invoked in recent centuries, but never formally removed from our pack's oldest traditions. A twin may challenge his brother's mating claim before the Elder Council, if he can demonstrate that a prior bond or intention existed that predates the current mating. Elena's blood ran cold. You cannot possibly believe such a claim would succeed. Cade and I are truly mated. Our bond is genuine. Perhaps, Damien said, but the law does not require proving the current bond false, only demonstrating sufficient prior claim to force a formal hearing before the council. And once such a hearing is convened, Elena, all manner of evidence becomes relevant, including evidence suggesting that Cade's leadership, his honesty, his very fitness to remain Alpha King, deserves serious scrutiny. You would tear apart this entire kingdom's stability, manipulate ancient laws never intended for such purposes, simply to satisfy your own jealousy and grief? Elena's voice shook with disbelief and growing anger. Damien, this is madness. Perhaps it is, Damien acknowledged, something haunted flickering behind his golden eyes. But I have had 10 years to consider precisely how much I have lost, and how little consideration my brother has shown for that loss. If invoking an old law forces this council, and you, to finally reckon honestly with everything Cade has taken from me, then I am prepared to accept whatever consequences follow. He turned to leave, pausing at the archive door to look back at her one final time. I did not come to Ashwood intending to fall into old patterns of feeling toward you, Elena. But I will not apologize for what has grown between us these past weeks, however unwelcome you may claim to find it. I have watched you, spoken with you, come to know your heart in ways I suspect my brother, consumed as he always is with matters of leadership, has never fully appreciated. Consider carefully, in the days ahead, whether the life you have built with Cade is truly the one that best serves your own happiness. He departed then, leaving Elena alone in the archive chamber, her heart pounding and her mind reeling with the full weight of everything she had just learned. Damien's grief was genuine. She understood now, but it had curdled over 10 long years of isolation into something far more dangerous, a consuming need to reclaim not merely justice, but everything he perceived his brother had taken from him, regardless of the devastation such a pursuit might inflict on innocent lives caught in its path. She rushed back to their private chambers immediately, finding Cade still deeply asleep, his expression finally peaceful for the first time in weeks. She hesitated at the bedside, torn between waking him immediately with this urgent revelation and allowing him this brief, precious moment of rest before the storm that was surely coming crashed down upon them both. In the end, urgency won over compassion. She gently shook him awake, watching his eyes snap open with immediate alertness, years of leadership having trained him to wake fully prepared for crisis at a moment's notice. Elena, what is wrong? I spoke with Damien tonight, in the archives, she said, sitting beside him and taking his hands in hers. Cade, he told me the truth. This was never truly about proving your guilt regarding Nora's death, not entirely. He is planning to invoke an ancient law, one that would allow him to challenge our mating bond before the Elder Council, claiming some form of prior intention toward me. Cade's expression transformed rapidly from sleepy confusion to disbelieving horror, then finally to a controlled fury that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. He intends to claim you as his own, using some archaic legal technicality never meant for such manipulation. He believes he has sufficient grounds to force a formal hearing, regardless of whether such a claim could ultimately succeed, Elena said. And Cade, he confessed that his grief over losing Nora has transformed, over these years of exile, into something far darker. Jealousy toward everything you possess, including now, apparently, feelings toward me that he claims have developed during his time here. Cade rose from the bed abruptly, pacing the room with barely contained violence in his movements, his composure finally, completely shattering under the weight of everything Elena had just revealed. I will not allow this. I will not allow my own brother to use twisted grief and jealousy as justification for tearing apart everything we have built together. Cade, please, you need to remain calm. If you react with anger before the council, it will only strengthen whatever narrative Damien is constructing about your fitness to lead. Calm, Cade repeated, whirling to face her, his amber eyes blazing with an intensity she had never witnessed from him before, not even during their most passionate moments together. "Elena, my own brother has just declared his intention to claim you as his mate, using manufactured evidence and manipulated ancient law to destroy everything I have built and everyone I love. How exactly do you expect me to remain calm in the face of such a threat?" Elena crossed the room and placed her hands firmly against his chest, forcing him to meet her eyes directly. "Because falling into the rage he clearly wants to provoke will only prove whatever accusations he intends to level against your character before this council. Cade, I need you here with me, steady and clear-headed, not consumed by jealousy and fury that plays directly into whatever trap he has spent 10 years constructing." Something in her steady, unwavering gaze seemed to reach him, and Elena watched as Cade fought visibly to reclaim his composure, drawing several deep, controlled breaths before finally speaking again, his voice tight but no longer edged with the dangerous fury of moments before. "You are right," he said quietly. "I apologize. It is simply—" He trailed off, shaking his head slowly. "The thought of losing you, Elena, to him of all people, after everything we have built together these past 3 years. I do not know if I possess the strength to remain composed while watching him attempt to claim what is mine." "I am not a possession to be claimed by anyone, Cade," Elena said gently but firmly. "Not by him, and not by you either. I chose you 3 years ago, freely and completely, and nothing Damien says or does before that council will change the truth of my heart. But I need you to trust that, to trust me, rather than allowing his manipulation to poison what we have built between us." Cade pulled her into his arms then, holding her with a desperate intensity that spoke to exactly how deeply Damien's threat had shaken him. "I trust you completely, Elena. It is my brother's madness I do not trust, and my own ability to remain composed while watching him attempt to tear us apart." Outside their window, the first pale light of dawn had begun creeping over the distant mountains, signaling the arrival of a new day that would bring with it challenges neither of them could fully anticipate. Somewhere within the pack hall, Elena knew, Damien was likely already preparing his formal petition to the Elder Council, setting in motion a legal challenge that would force their entire kingdom to confront a decade of buried grief, jealousy, and manipulation that threatened to unravel everything Elena and Cade had built together. The battle for their bond, Elena realized with growing dread, was only just beginning. Damien's formal petition arrived before the Elder Council 2 days later, delivered with the same careful precision that had characterized every move he had made since his return to Ashwood. The chamber, when the council convened to hear the petition, was more crowded than Elena had ever seen it, word of the unprecedented challenge having spread through every corner of the pack territory within hours of its filing. Priya read the petition aloud before the assembled council, her voice carrying the weight of genuine reluctance at having to give formal consideration to such an extraordinary claim. According to ancient tradition, dating back to a time before the pack's current legal structures had fully solidified, a twin could indeed challenge his sibling's mating bond if he could demonstrate that circumstances existed which predated and potentially superseded that bond. Damien's petition claimed, with careful legal precision, that his prior relationship with Nora and the striking resemblance Elena bore to his lost intended mate constituted grounds for the council to consider whether fate itself had intended Elena for him rather than for his brother. The claim was, on its surface, almost absurd in its reasoning, and Elena watched several elders exchange skeptical glances as Priya finished reading the formal petition. But she also understood, with growing dread, exactly what Damien's true strategy was. The petition itself did not need to succeed to accomplish his goals. It merely needed to force a formal hearing, one that would require extensive testimony, cross-examination, and public scrutiny of every aspect of Cade's character, leadership, and personal history. "This petition is without precedent in recent memory," Priya said carefully, addressing the assembled council. "The ancient law it invokes has not been exercised in over 2 centuries, and its exact requirements for proof remain ambiguous at best. This council must decide whether the petition meets even the minimal threshold required to proceed to formal hearing. The debate that followed stretched for hours, elders arguing passionately on both sides of the question. Some insisted that ancient law, however rarely used, deserved respect and formal consideration, regardless of how unusual the circumstances. Others argued forcefully that Damien's petition represented nothing more than a transparent attempt to weaponize legal technicality in service of personal grievance, unworthy of formal council time given the destabilizing effect such a hearing would inevitably have on pack unity. Elena sat rigid throughout the entire debate, watching Cade beside her maintaining a carefully composed exterior that she knew concealed a churning storm of fury and fear beneath its surface. When the council finally called for a vote on whether to proceed with formal hearing, the chamber fell into tense silence as each elder cast their decision. The final tally, when Priya announced it, sent a ripple of shocked murmurs through the assembled crowd. 6 votes in favor of proceeding to formal hearing, 5 opposed. By the narrowest possible margin, Damien's petition would move forward, forcing Ashwood's council into uncharted legal territory that threatened to consume the kingdom's stability for weeks to come. The hearing will be scheduled for 1 month from today, Priya announced, her expression grave. This will allow both parties adequate time to prepare testimony and evidence. I remind everyone present that regardless of personal opinions regarding this petition's merit, this council's proceedings must be conducted with dignity and respect for our pack's ancient traditions, however uncomfortable their application may prove in this particular circumstance. The chamber erupted into a cacophony of whispered conversation as the session concluded, elders and pack members alike processing the shocking reality that their kingdom now faced a month of escalating tension before a hearing that could fundamentally alter its leadership and stability. Elena felt Cade's hand find hers beneath the council table, gripping tightly, and she squeezed back, trying to offer whatever comfort and strength she could in the face of this devastating development. The weeks that followed tested every fiber of Elena and Cade's resolve. Damien, emboldened by the council's decision to proceed with formal hearing, began actively campaigning for pack support, presenting himself at gatherings and community events with carefully cultivated charm, positioning himself as a wronged prince seeking long overdue justice rather than the calculating manipulator Elena now understood him to genuinely be. Cade, meanwhile, found himself increasingly isolated as certain pack members, swayed by Damien's persuasive narrative and the mounting evidence regarding Victor's mysterious disappearance, began quietly questioning his fitness to continue as their Alpha King. The pressure took a visible toll, deepening the shadows beneath his eyes and shortening his temper in ways that further played into whatever narrative Damien was constructing about his brother's stability and character. Elena watched helplessly as the bond she and Cade had built over 3 years began showing signs of strain under this relentless pressure. Small arguments erupted between them over matters that would never have troubled their relationship before Damien's return. Exhaustion and fear making both of them more brittle and quick to misunderstand each other's intentions. She found herself lying awake many nights, staring at the ceiling while Cade slept fitfully beside her, wondering whether their bond, however genuine and strong it had once been, could truly withstand the sustained assault Damien had orchestrated against it. Grace remained a steady source of support throughout these difficult weeks, offering both practical assistance in preparing for the hearing and the emotional comfort of genuine friendship during a time when Elena felt increasingly uncertain who among the pack she could truly trust. "You look exhausted," Grace observed one afternoon, finding Elena reviewing old pack records in the archive chamber, searching desperately for any additional evidence that might strengthen Cade's position before the upcoming hearing. "I do not know how much longer I can watch this happen," Elena admitted, setting aside the records she had been studying. Every day, more pack members seem to question Cade's leadership. Every day, Damien grows more confident, more certain that his manipulation will succeed. "Have you found anything useful in the records?" Grace asked, settling into the chair across from her. Fragments, Elena said. Enough to suggest inconsistencies in Damien's timeline, but nothing conclusive enough to definitively expose his manipulation before the entire council. She rubbed her tired eyes, exhaustion weighing heavily on every part of her body. I fear that regardless of what evidence we present, the mere existence of this hearing has already accomplished what Damien truly wanted. He has planted enough doubt, enough division within this pack, that even a favorable ruling may not fully restore what Cade has lost these past weeks. Grace reached across the table, taking Elena's hand in a gesture of quiet solidarity. Do not lose hope yet. There is still time before the hearing, and truth has a way of eventually surfacing, however carefully someone attempts to bury it. Elena wanted desperately to believe her friend's reassurance, but as the days continued passing and the hearing date drew inexorably closer, she found her confidence wavering more with each passing sunset. She had begun noticing something else troubling as well, something she had not yet found the courage to share even with Grace. Damien's attention toward her, rather than diminishing following his open confession in the archive chamber, seemed instead to be intensifying, his careful, patient presence appearing with increasing frequency in places she frequented throughout the packed territory. She encountered him again one evening, nearly 3 weeks before the scheduled hearing, while walking alone through the same eastern ridge where he had first revealed his true feelings toward her. She had told herself she needed the solitude to clear her mind before another difficult day of hearing preparation, but some cautious part of her recognized, even as she made her way toward that familiar overlook, that she was perhaps unconsciously hoping to encounter him again, driven by a need to understand him better before the hearing forced them into direct confrontation. He was already there when she arrived, seated on the same flat rock, watching the sunset with an expression of quiet melancholy that made her pause before announcing her presence. I wondered if you might return here eventually, he said without turning, apparently having sensed her approach despite her careful silence. I did not come here to see you, Elena said, though even as she spoke the words, she recognized their partial dishonesty. Perhaps not consciously, Damien said, finally turning to look at her. But some part of you continues seeking me out, Elena, just as some part of me cannot seem to stay away from you, despite understanding fully how much pain my presence causes both you and my brother. Why are you truly doing this, Damien? Elena asked, moving closer despite every rational instinct warning her to maintain distance. I understand the grief, the jealousy that has festered during your years of exile, but this hearing, this public spectacle you have orchestrated, it will not bring Nora back. It will not undo whatever wrong you believe was done to you a decade ago. All it will accomplish is destroying whatever remains of the relationship between you and your brother, and potentially the stability of this entire pack. Damien was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening valley below. Do you know what it feels like, Elena, to lose the person you believed would define the entire course of your future? To watch that future crumble in a single, devastating night, and then to spend a decade in isolation, replaying every moment of that loss, wondering endlessly what you might have done differently to prevent it? No, Elena admitted honestly, I cannot fully understand that particular grief. I did not think you could, Damien said, something gentler entering his voice than she had heard in weeks. But I think, perhaps, you understand what it means to build a life around someone, to structure your entire sense of identity and purpose around a bond with another person. And I think, if you are honest with yourself, some part of you understands why I cannot simply release my claim to justice, however uncomfortable and disruptive pursuing it has proven for everyone involved. There is a difference between seeking justice for Nora's death and attempting to claim me as some form of substitute for the life you lost, Elena said firmly. Damien, I care about the grief you carry. I even understand, in some measure, the anger you feel toward circumstances that took Nora from you far too soon. But I will never be her replacement, and this hearing will not grant you the peace you claim to be seeking. Damien rose slowly from the rock, moving closer than Elena felt entirely comfortable with, though something in his expression, weary and genuinely conflicted, kept her from immediately retreating. "Perhaps you are right. Perhaps this entire endeavor is doomed to leave me exactly as empty as I was before I returned to Ashwood. But Elena, I find that I cannot simply abandon this path now, not when it has already progressed this far. Not when some part of me still believes that perhaps, against all reasonable expectation, you might come to see in me something worth choosing freely, rather than something to be feared or resisted." "That will never happen," Elena said, her voice firm despite the strange, unwelcome complexity of emotion this conversation had stirred within her. "My heart belongs to Cade, completely and irrevocably. Nothing you say or do before that council will change that fundamental truth." Something flickered across Damien's expression, disappointment mixed with a stubborn, dangerous determination that made Elena's unease sharpen once more. "We shall see, Elena. The hearing has not yet occurred, and I have spent 10 years learning that patience, however difficult to maintain, often yields results that impatience never could." He turned and walked away into the gathering darkness, leaving Elena standing alone once more on that familiar ridge, her heart heavy with the growing certainty that whatever careful strategy Damien had constructed extended far beyond the legal technicalities of his formal petition. He was playing a longer game, one designed to slowly, patiently erode her certainty and her bond with Cade, regardless of how the upcoming hearing ultimately resolved. She made her way back toward the pack hall beneath a sky now fully dark and scattered with distant stars, uncertain how much longer she could continue navigating this treacherous path between her husband's mounting desperation and his brother's patient, calculating pursuit, without something inside her, or inside her fragile marriage, finally breaking beyond repair. Elena did not tell Cade about the conversation on the ridge that night, and this time her silence was not born of fear or hesitation, but of a genuine uncertainty about how to explain the strange, unwelcome complexity of feelings the exchange had stirred within her. She did not love Damien. She was entirely certain of that fundamental truth. But some part of her, some quiet and troubled corner of her heart, could not help but feel a genuine sympathy for the depth of his grief, even as she recognized how thoroughly that grief had corrupted his judgment and intentions. She told herself the silence was temporary, that she would find the right moment to share everything with Cade once the immediate pressure of preparing for the hearing had eased slightly. But as the days continued passing, that right moment never seemed to arrive, and the unspoken conversation settled into an uncomfortable weight between them, one more secret crack forming in a bond already strained nearly to its breaking point. It was Cade himself who finally forced the confrontation, nearly 2 weeks before the scheduled hearing, when he returned to their chambers late one evening to find Elena standing at the window, lost in troubled thought, unaware of his arrival until he spoke. "You have been distant lately," he said quietly, causing her to startle before turning to face him. "I have noticed you slipping away in the evenings, returning distracted and quiet. Elena, please, tell me what is happening." She considered, for one final moment, maintaining her silence. But the exhaustion of carrying this secret alone, combined with the genuine love and trust that had defined their bond for 3 years, finally overcame her hesitation. "I have been meeting Damien," she admitted. "Not intentionally, at first, but these past weeks I have found myself returning to the same place he frequents, and we have spoken, several times, about Nora, about his grief, about—" She trailed off, uncertain how to continue without wounding him further. Cade's expression shifted rapidly through several emotions, confusion giving way to hurt, then to a dawning, dangerous anger that made Elena's chest tighten with dread. "About what, Elena? What else have you and my brother discussed during these secret meetings you neglected to mention to me?" "They were not secret meetings," Elena said quickly, though even as she spoke, she recognized how weak the distinction sounded, given how carefully she had avoided mentioning them. "I simply did not know how to tell you without adding to everything else you have already been carrying these past weeks." You did not know how to tell me that my own brother has been pursuing you, confessing feelings toward you, while I remain entirely ignorant of these conversations occurring behind my back? Cade's voice had risen now, the careful control he had maintained throughout weeks of mounting pressure finally beginning to crack entirely. Elena, I specifically asked you weeks ago to tell me immediately if Damien attempted any further contact. Instead, I discover you have been meeting him repeatedly, keeping these encounters hidden from me. I was not hiding them out of any disloyalty toward you, Elena insisted, her own frustration and hurt rising to meet his. I was trying to protect you from additional pain during an already devastating time. Cade, nothing has happened between us beyond conversation. My heart remains entirely yours, completely and without question. Then why keep it secret? Cade demanded, pacing the room with barely contained agitation. If nothing occurred that you feared my reaction to, why not simply tell me openly, as I asked you to do? Elena struggled to find an answer that would adequately explain the complicated tangle of emotions that had kept her silent, the genuine sympathy she felt for Damien's grief warring against her complete loyalty to Cade, the fear of adding more weight to her husband's already crushing burden competing against her instinct toward complete honesty within their marriage. I do not entirely know, she admitted finally, tears beginning to blur her vision. I think, perhaps, some part of me felt sympathy for his pain, even while recognizing how dangerously it has corrupted his actions. I think I was afraid that admitting these conversations occurred would somehow validate the doubts Damien has been trying to plant, that you might begin questioning whether some part of me was genuinely tempted by whatever he was offering. And was some part of you tempted? Cade asked, his voice dropping to something quiet and dangerous, amber eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she forced herself to meet his gaze directly. No, Elena said firmly, without hesitation. Cade, I love you. I chose you 3 years ago, and I choose you again every single day since. Whatever sympathy I feel for the grief driving Damien's actions does not diminish, even slightly, my complete devotion to you and to the life we have built together. Something in her unwavering certainty seemed to reach through Cade's mounting jealousy and fury, and she watched the dangerous edge in his expression slowly begin to soften, replaced by an exhausted, wounded vulnerability that broke her heart to witness. I am sorry, he said quietly. I know I should trust your heart, Elena, but these past weeks have worn away at my ability to trust anything with certainty. My own brother is trying to destroy everything I have built, using ancient law and manufactured evidence to claim you as his own, and I find myself terrified, constantly, that somehow he might succeed, that I might lose you the way I have already lost so much else to his campaign of destruction. Elena crossed the room and pulled him into her arms, feeling the exhausted tension coiled through his entire body finally beginning to ease, if only slightly, beneath her embrace. You will not lose me, Cade. Not to Damien, not to this hearing, not to anything, but I need you to trust me completely, just as I trust you, if we are going to survive whatever comes next intact. I trust you, Cade said, his voice muffled against her hair. I am simply struggling to trust myself, to trust my own judgment and control, when everything I love feels threatened so completely. They stood together in silence for a long moment, finding some measure of comfort in each other's presence, despite everything working to tear them apart. But even as Elena held her husband close, feeling the genuine love and devotion that still bound them together, despite weeks of mounting pressure, she could not shake the uncomfortable awareness that Damien's careful campaign had already inflicted damage that a single honest conversation could not fully repair. 3 days later, that damage manifested in a way neither of them had anticipated, when Cade, driven to the absolute limits of his patience by weeks of mounting pressure and jealousy, made a decision that would nearly destroy everything he had been fighting so desperately to protect. He confronted Damien directly, alone, in the training grounds near the edge of Pack territory, having learned from a nervous young pack member that Damien frequently practiced combat exercises there in the early morning hours, before the rest of the pack awakened. Elena learned of the confrontation only afterward, pieced together from fragmented accounts offered by shaken witnesses who had happened upon the scene partway through its unfolding. According to those accounts, the confrontation began with words. Cade's carefully maintained composure finally shattering entirely as he confronted his brother about the true intentions behind his campaign of manufactured evidence and legal manipulation. Damien, for his part, offered no denial, instead meeting his brother's fury with cold, calculated provocation, deliberately needling every wound Cade carried regarding Nora's death, regarding his fitness to lead, regarding the growing uncertainty about whether Elena's loyalty could withstand the sustained pressure of Damien's patient pursuit. What began as heated words eventually escalated into physical confrontation, the two brothers grappling with a violence born of 10 years of buried grief and resentment, finally erupting beyond any semblance of control. By the time other pack members arrived to separate them, both brothers bore visible injuries, and the training grounds bore witness to a confrontation that would only further fuel the narrative Damien had been carefully constructing about his brother's dangerous, unstable temperament. Elena arrived at the healing chambers to find Cade being treated for a deep gash along his forearm, his expression carrying a mixture of exhausted fury and dawning horror at what he had allowed himself to become in the heat of that confrontation. "What have I done?" he said quietly as she rushed to his side, the healer working carefully to clean and bind his wound. "Elena, I played directly into his hands. Every pack member who witnessed that confrontation will now testify before the council about my temper, my instability, exactly the narrative Damien needed to strengthen his case." "We will address it," Elena said, though her own heart was heavy with the recognition of how severely this confrontation had damaged their position before the upcoming hearing. "Cade, what matters now is how we move forward from this moment. We cannot undo what happened, but we can control how we respond to it." But even as she offered these words of comfort, Elena understood with growing dread that Damien's patient, calculated campaign had achieved perhaps its most significant victory yet. He had successfully provoked his brother into exactly the kind of public, violent confrontation that would validate every doubt he had been carefully cultivating among the pack these past weeks. And with the formal hearing now less than 2 weeks away, Elena feared that this single moment of lost control might prove far more damaging to Cade's position than anything else Damien had presented before the council thus far. That evening, as Elena sat beside Cade's bed, watching him finally succumb to exhausted, troubled sleep, she found herself facing an uncomfortable truth she could no longer avoid. If they were going to survive the upcoming hearing with their bond, their family, and Cade's leadership intact, she would need to take decisive action herself, rather than continuing to react defensively to whatever new challenge Damien's patient manipulation presented next. She rose quietly from the bedside and made her way to Edwin's chamber, determined to uncover whatever remaining truth might exist about the true circumstances of Nora's death and Victor's disappearance, before Damien's carefully constructed narrative could claim its final, devastating victory over everything she and Cade had built together. Edwin listened intently as Elena explained her urgent need to uncover the complete truth before the hearing, his weathered face creasing with renewed determination despite the late hour. "I have continued my quiet investigation these past weeks, Your Majesty, though I confess I have found little that definitively resolves the questions surrounding Victor's fate. However, there is one avenue I have not yet fully pursued, one that occurred to me only recently." "What is it?" "The witness statement Prince Damien presented, describing warriors escorting Victor under guard, named specific individuals who served under Cade's command that year," Edwin said. "I have located records indicating that 2 of those named warriors are still alive, though they left Ashwood territory years ago to settle in neighboring lands. If we could locate and question them directly, we might finally learn what truly happened to Victor, and whether Damien's implications hold any genuine merit." How quickly could such warriors be located and brought before the council? With the hearing less than 2 weeks away, it would require considerable urgency, Edwin admitted. But I believe it is possible, if we act immediately and spare no resource in the effort. Elena authorized the search immediately, and over the following days, Edwin's careful network of contacts worked tirelessly to locate the 2 former warriors named in Damien's witness statement. The search proved more complicated than anticipated, one warrior having relocated multiple times over the intervening years, but persistence eventually paid dividends, and 4 days before the scheduled hearing, both former warriors arrived in Ashwood territory, prepared to offer testimony before the Elder Council. What they revealed, in careful questioning conducted jointly by Edwin and several trusted elders, finally illuminated the truth that had remained buried for a full decade. Victor had indeed been a traitor, exactly as his confession letter claimed, having accepted payment from the rival territory in exchange for information about patrol movements that ultimately led to Nora's death. But contrary to Damien's carefully constructed implication, Victor had not been silenced by Cade's order. Rather, the 2 warriors testified, Victor had fled Ashwood territory of his own accord, terrified of facing justice for his betrayal once his guilt became suspected by pack leadership. The warriors had indeed escorted him, but only as far as the territory border, following explicit orders to ensure he left Ashwood lands peacefully, rather than facing violence from grieving pack members who had already begun suspecting his involvement in the tragedy. Victor had survived, the warriors confirmed, settling eventually in distant territory under an assumed identity, where he had lived out his remaining years in obscurity before passing away from natural causes several years prior, the guilt of his betrayal apparently having haunted him until his final days, based on fragments of confession he had reportedly shared with a local healer shortly before his death. The revelation, when presented formally before the Elder Council 2 days before the scheduled hearing, sent shockwaves through the assembled elders and pack members. Cade had not orchestrated Victor's disappearance or silencing. He had simply ensured a confessed traitor left pack territory alive, a decision motivated by justice, tempered with mercy, rather than any conspiracy to hide his own guilt. Damien, present at the council session where this testimony was revealed, sat in stunned, visible shock as the careful narrative he had constructed over months of patient manipulation crumbled entirely before the assembled elders. Elena watched him carefully throughout the proceedings, noting the moment when genuine grief, long buried beneath layers of calculated vengeance, finally broke through his composed exterior entirely. "This does not change what happened to Nora," Damien said, his voice breaking as he addressed the council following the warrior's testimony. "She is still dead. My brother still made the tactical decision that placed her in that vulnerable position that fatal night. A decision made without malicious intent, based on the information available at the time," Priya said gently. "Prince Damien, this council recognizes the depth of your grief, and we do not diminish the genuine loss you have carried these past 10 years. But the evidence now clearly demonstrates that your accusations against your brother's character and honesty were built upon a foundation of misunderstanding, however genuinely you may have believed in their validity." The formal hearing, scheduled for 2 days later, proceeded despite this revelation, as the ancient law's technical requirements had already been satisfied when the council initially agreed to consider Damien's petition. But the atmosphere surrounding the proceeding had transformed entirely from the tense uncertainty of previous weeks into something closer to somber resolution. The assembled pack understanding now that whatever verdict emerged from this hearing would address not genuine doubt about Cade's fitness to lead, but rather the tragic consequences of unresolved grief that had festered into dangerous obsession over a decade of isolation. Elena stood beside Cade as the hearing formally opened, watching Damien across the chamber, his earlier confidence entirely replaced by something haunted and exhausted, the weight of 10 years of misdirected anger finally settling fully upon his shoulders now that the foundation supporting his campaign had crumbled so completely. "Prince Damien," Priya said, opening the formal proceedings. You have petitioned this council to consider your claim upon Queen Elena, based upon your prior relationship with Nora and the ancient law permitting such challenges under specific circumstances. Given the testimony revealed these past 2 days, do you wish to withdraw this petition, or do you intend to proceed with formal argument before this council? The chamber fell silent, every eye fixed upon Damien as he rose slowly to his feet, his expression carrying none of the calculated confidence that had defined his presence throughout these past difficult weeks. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, stripped of pretense entirely. I wish to address this council honestly, for the first time since my return to Ashwood, he said. I did not return here seeking genuine justice for Nora's death, though I convinced myself, for a time, that this was my true purpose. I returned carrying 10 years of grief that had transformed, gradually and painfully, into something far uglier than simple mourning. I returned consumed by jealousy toward everything my brother had built, and I believed I had been denied, and when I encountered Elena, when I recognized in her something of the woman I had lost, I allowed that jealousy to convince me that claiming her might somehow heal wounds that have never truly closed. He turned to face Elena directly, genuine remorse etched into every line of his expression. I am sorry, Elena, for the pain and uncertainty I have caused you these past weeks. You deserved honesty from the moment I arrived, not the calculated manipulation I instead chose to pursue. Whatever grief drove my actions, it does not excuse the harm I have inflicted upon you, upon my brother, and upon this pack's stability. He turned then to face Cade, and for the first time since his return, something resembling genuine brotherly connection flickered between the twins. 10 years of buried resentment finally beginning to crack beneath the weight of honest reckoning. Brother, I have spent a decade believing you responsible for taking everything from me. I understand now that grief convinced me of a truth that never genuinely existed, that Victor's betrayal, not your leadership, caused the tragedy that destroyed my future. I do not know if I can ever fully release the anger I have carried, but I recognize now that continuing to direct it toward you, toward your marriage, serves no purpose beyond perpetuating the very pain I have been trying so desperately to escape. Cade rose slowly, crossing the chamber to stand before his brother, and the assembled council watched in tense silence as the Alpha King studied his twin's face for a long, searching moment. I forgive you, Cade said finally, his voice carrying genuine emotion despite weeks of anger and hurt. Not because what you have done these past weeks was acceptable, but because I understand, perhaps better than anyone else in this chamber, exactly how deeply grief can distort even the most well-intentioned heart. I lost a friend that night too, Damien. I have carried my own guilt over that decision for 10 years, even knowing I made the best choice available with the information I possessed at the time. I withdraw my petition, Damien said, addressing the council formally once more. Elena belongs with my brother, as she always has. I was wrong to challenge that truth, wrong to use manufactured doubt and manipulated evidence in pursuit of grief. I should have processed honestly rather than weaponized against the people I claim to love. Priya accepted the formal withdrawal, and the Elder Council moved swiftly to close the hearing, the assembled pack members releasing a collective breath of relief as the tension that had gripped Ashwood for weeks finally began to ease. But Elena, watching the two brothers standing together for the first time since Damien's return without the poison of manipulation and accusation between them, understood that true healing would require far more than a single moment of honest reckoning before the council. In the weeks that followed the hearing's conclusion, Ashwood slowly began rebuilding the stability and trust that Damien's campaign had so thoroughly disrupted. Cade worked carefully to restore pack confidence in his leadership, addressing the elders and warriors who had questioned his fitness during the crisis, with patient honesty about the mistakes he had made and the lessons he had learned throughout the ordeal. Elena, for her part, found herself surprisingly drawn into an unlikely friendship with Damien as he began the long, difficult process of genuine healing. Their shared understanding of loss and grief, however different in origin, providing an unexpected foundation for reconciliation that neither of them could have anticipated when he had first arrived at Ashwood's northern border weeks before. Damien eventually chose to remain in Ashwood territory, not as a rival to his brother's throne, but as a contributing member of the Pack Council, his knowledge of the Eastern Territories proving genuinely valuable to renewed diplomatic efforts that had been abandoned during the crisis of his petition. It was not a perfect resolution, Elena understood, the wounds of 10 years of separation and misdirected anger requiring far longer than a few weeks to fully heal. But it was a beginning, a foundation upon which genuine brotherly trust might eventually be rebuilt, given sufficient time and continued honest effort from both twins. On a quiet evening several months after the hearing's conclusion, Elena stood once more upon the eastern ridge overlooking Ashwood's valley, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, the same view that had witnessed so much pain and revelation throughout the preceding months. Cade found her there, settling beside her with the easy comfort of a bond that had weathered its greatest test and emerged, ultimately, stronger for having survived it. "Do you regret any of it?" he asked quietly, watching the last light fade from the sky. "The uncertainty, the doubt, everything Damien's campaign put us through?" Elena considered the question carefully before answering, leaning into her husband's steady embrace. "I regret the pain it caused, the trust it strained between us. But I do not regret what we learned through surviving it together. Our bond was tested more severely these past months than I ever imagined possible, and it held, Cade. It held because what exists between us is genuine, stronger than jealousy, stronger than manipulation, stronger than even the deepest grief." Cade pressed a gentle kiss against her hair, holding her close as the first stars began appearing in the darkening sky above them. "I love you, Elena, completely, irrevocably, and without any doubt remaining in my heart about the strength of what we share." "I love you too," Elena said softly, watching the stars multiply across the vast expanse above them. "And I believe, now more than ever, that whatever challenges the future brings, we possess exactly the strength needed to face them together, as we always have." Below them, in the valley that had witnessed both their greatest trial and their ultimate triumph, the Pack of Ashwood continued its quiet evening routines. The crisis that had once threatened to consume their entire community now settling gently into memory, another difficult chapter in a long history of resilience and renewal. And upon that familiar ridge, beneath a sky filled with countless stars, the Alpha King and his queen stood together, their bond unbroken, their love proven true through fire, ready to face whatever future still awaited them, side by side, exactly as they were always meant to be.